Hello, Giants fans, and welcome to a new edition of the Valentine's Views podcast here on Big Blue View Radio. Please like, share, and subscribe if you're watching us on YouTube, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts across the Big Blue View Radio network. All right, when we get into April, we get closer and closer to the NFL draft. One of my favorite things to do is to talk to Matt Waldman of the Rookie Scouting Portfolio. And that's what we're going to do today. Matt just released his 2024 Rookie Scouting Portfolio Draft Guide. And if you're not familiar, you need to get familiar. Matt, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Ed. It's always a pleasure to do this at this time of year. And we're going to have a lot of fun talking about these guys, I have a feeling.
And, I just need to warn folks. You guys are used to my 25-minute, half-hour podcasts. This is not going to be one of those. Talking to Matt Waldman does not take just 25 minutes to a half an hour. It takes a while. So settle in, folks. We're going to be here for a little while. What we're probably going to do is do this show in two parts. We're going to start talking about quarterbacks. If we get far enough through that, we'll do the second part of the show on running backs, wide receivers, tight ends, all of Matt's skill position forte. If we're still in the middle of talking about quarterbacks, we'll do two parts entirely on the 2024 quarterback class. So we'll see where this goes. So Matt, we're going to settle in for a little bit here.
Sounds good to me. I'm ready.
All right. I don't want to dive right into prospect analysis and, why is this guy QB1 on your board? Why is this guy QB6? Why do you think, this guy has a higher chance to fail, than another guy? What I want to talk about is the New York Giants. And I want to talk a little bit about quarterback theory when it comes to the NFL draft. And the first thing that came up, Kurt Benkert, who's a former NFL quarterback, does a lot of draft study now of quarterbacks. He was on a show the other day, and he said that he would feel sorry for Drake Maye if Drake Maye landed with the Giants. He said in his mind, the Giants are a terrible situation for a young quarterback, whether it's Drake Maye or whether it's anybody else, just because of the uncertainty, because of the lack of talent, all of that. So what I want to start with is, where do you stand on the New York Giants and whether they're a good situation or their readiness to draft and develop a young quarterback?
I don't think it's really that much different than any other organization, with the exception of a small few, because I'm more of the take that why pick on the Giants when you can pick on the entire league and the history they have of just being craptastic with developing quarterbacks, because they don't understand the position. No one really does, because there's so many variables to it, to developing it. There's no template for a good quarterback. Now, the average fan might say, yes, there is. Bill Parcells, the greatest Giant to ever, grace the NFL, had a template that he used. Well, it's a bullet point template, and Bill was a great coach, but as an evaluator, it's a bullet point template to cover your assets when you justify a big pick, because you're not going to pick. If you picked Brock Purdy in the second round and he worked out, you're going to look like a genius. If you pick Brock Purdy in the second round or in the first round and he failed miserably, you're going to get fired. But if you pick Drew Lock in the first round and he went to a reasonably big school, has a big arm, has the body you're looking for, had the requisite completion percentage, even if completion percentage really doesn't show you accuracy, and we can get into that at another time or later on. All the different things they look at, it sounds good when reporters ask the question, why this guy didn't work out. And you say, yeah, but when you look at the quarterbacks across the league, they have these things in common. Well, dogs have certain things in common. Some dogs, though, are good at working. Some dogs are good for security. Some dogs are good at nothing but eating, sleeping, and farting. Okay. So,
All right.
we can sit there and make this thing. So I would just say that when it comes to the Giants, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily want to pick on them. I would rather just kind of pick at the league and say they've just discovered recently that processing information is more important than just book smarts and remembering something on a whiteboard, and that they're two different forms of intelligence. And they still haven't figured out how to identify that away from the field as opposed to looking at it on the field. They're trying to, it's like nutrition. The doctor could spend a lot of time talking about nutrition, which they don't. But if they did, they tell you what to eat, what not to eat, but everyone's looking for a magic pill instead of like just breaking down and saying, you know what, I'm not going to eat sugar, I'm not going to eat fried foods, I'm not going to eat a lot of processed stuff. I'm just going to look for a pill to mask the symptoms of the things that I've got going on. Well, the NFL does that when a scout or evaluators or quarterbacks or anybody will say, here's what you look for when you're looking for a player's game. And while certainly certain pills or supplements or things can help you, there's obviously medical conditions people have that pharmaceuticals will have to help with. But like certainly modeling and certain statistics and certain analytics can be helpful to identifying things, but they're not the entire answer or the answer. They're a part of everything else. And so if you're saying, well, process, the S2 is going to help us identify the great quarterback. No, it's going to be a layer, and they don't even know where that layer is going to fit yet because they screwed it up with CJ Stroud already. And it's it's about finding up their place for how this will actually work. And they're years away from that. Whereas watching film and identifying and charting and looking at, what actual accuracy is, what they were actually trying to do, what the defenses looked like. That's the real nutrition, and that's the real work. And it seems like a lot of teams don't understand that. And there's the whole human element on top of it of how quickly they learn, how well they learn, how much they want to learn. Drew Lock, I'll tell this story because he's with the Giants now, and I think that Drew is going to be in a chance to turn a corner. But I remember evaluating him and saying he looked like a kid who's very talented, who at some point during his high school career and college career, he was probably told by outside quarterback coaches, by coaches in his program, things that he could work on to become the best quarterback he could be and get more ready for the NFL. And when he came to the league, Peyton Manning called hhim up and said, anything I can do for you, you let me know. Now, easy for me to say as a 54-year-old man, in hindsight, what I would have liked to have done if I were able to be in Drew Lock's situation at that point, because I probably would have said, with the wisdom I have now, which is unfair to Drew, but would have been, can I live in your garage, do chores for you, whatever I need to do, and basically spend as much time as possible reviewing film with you and having you reviewing my game and you showing me what conceptually I need to get better at and work and how to work at my craft technically and conceptually to get better. But from what I was told, and what I was told is that he said thanks and didn't call him back. And then 3 years later, when Teddy Bridgewater was brought to town to compete for his job with him, that's when he called Peyton Manning. And one of my contacts spoke with Drew's dad, who was at practices, and said, he knew my scouting report of Drew, where I said he was probably told a lot of things, and Drew probably thought, I'll work on it later, like a lot of young people would. I'm not denigrating Drew because this is about wisdom that a lot of young people don't have. And he was told how good he was, and he was good. He was a good Division I SEC quarterback who was considered a top prospect. Now, he was QB6 on my board that year, but he was a player that I thought, when he had to do things that the NFL would require him to do, when it happened in the SEC against top teams, he couldn't do it. He looked like someone who was like, like the smart kid in class who didn't study, and then he was given a test that tested abilities that were beyond what he would have had. He had to work at it to get to do well on the test, but he hadn't worked at it, and you could tell he hadn't worked at it. And it was just little details and techniques that would carry over to the NFL. And his dad told a sideline reporter, I love my son. He's a great kid. He's a good guy, but we've been telling him for years, here are little details you need to work on. Here's things that you need to get better at. When you get to the NFL, this is going to be different. And he just smiled and nodded and he listened, but he didn't work at it. He didn't do those things. He didn't either. And it's kind of catching up to him. And you can see in Seattle when he had some nice games, you kind of get the impression that it's kind of clicked in his head that, oh, yeah, maybe this is how I need to work. Doesn't make him a bad kid, doesn't make him a bad player. It just means that he had to get better at his job and maybe didn't know how about doing that. And maybe it didn't register what was being told to him because it's easy for people to tell you the NFL is a lot tougher. And I share that because the important point of this is that a lot of players go through this, and the NFL doesn't support that well because they force players in immediately when the best players, generally, when you look at some of the best players in the league over the past 20 years, whether it was even Jordan Love last year and how well he did, to Patrick Mahomes, or by accident like Tom Brady and Brett Favre, or by plan with Aaron Rodgers or with Drew Brees, they either got time to sit, or with Drew Brees' case, he said Marty Schottenheimer gave me intermittent starting and benching. And when he benched me, it wasn't, I'm not talking to you and I'm disgusted with you. It was, Drew, I'm benching you because you're not seeing the field well and you look like you're rushing and you look like it's the game's gotten ahead of you. You need to sit a bit. You're our guy. Okay. If we get back into this game and it's late, I'm putting you back in probably to give you a chance. But go watch the veteran, see what he has to do. And I could mention other MVPs, Steve McNair, Tom Brady. I mean, there's got Steve Young sat for years and he was awful at Tampa when he came from the USFL. Now it was a bad team too. But that's the thing, is that teams rush guys, put them in a bad scenario where maybe the offensive line isn't strong enough yet, the receivers aren't veterans or strong enough yet, and then these guys don't have the reinforcement of performing with top professionals who are doing what they're supposed to do at the time it's supposed to happen. And with the quarterback position, where you are, everything is timing and confidence of timing, where you're integrating so many different types of skill sets and intelligence types and motor skills and technique that if everything's not well timed, then it falls flat. And then you lose confidence or you start questioning your teammates and players. It's like playing music. If you play music with great musicians, they're going to help you level up. Brock Purdy got the benefit of that because everything that his game is good at is anticipation and being able to be confident with his time. He was always good at that at Iowa State. And he was always good in the pocket. Didn't have a great arm. But in San Francisco, with a great line, with good receivers and a great system, all that just reinforced all the good things he did. But if he were playing in New England, because Mac Jones had similar skills, if he were playing in New England with an okay offensive line, with a defensive coordinator as your offensive coordinator, and receivers that, if you're going to go after Bill Belichick for anything, you'd say, how in the hell did you pay Devontae Parker the kind of money you paid for a guy who should be a wide receiver too at best on your team as your top guy, and you don't have anything but slot receivers? So when you look at Mac Jones play, a lot of that is it's going to get worse because everything's leveling down. And so Kurt Banker's point, there's some accuracy in being concerned from any team that if their line isn't strong enough and you're going to put a quarterback in a situation where you've got already two quarterbacks who are startable, and and there's maybe some uncertainty about what you're going to do with that quarterback room. Maybe there's questions there, but I wouldn't overly pick on the Giants as the worst disaster. I would say they're not much different than most other teams. And if they're wise about how they have a plan for that player and give him time to sit behind options, the options they have, then I think it's not that bigger of a problem than any other.
All right, I want to give you a quick story, and it's going to lead into another sort of NFL quarterback question. This is not a quarterback, but I remember as you were talking about guys, the way that guys learn and all of that. I thought about a conversation that I had with a former Giants defensive end, Demontre Moore, a few years back. Moore was a third round pick, and he wound up being a disappointment for the Giants. And I remember talking to him in training camp of his second season. He and I just sitting at a table talking, just the two of us talking. And he said, he said, when I got drafted, I thought this was going to be like every other level that I've ever played at. I thought I was going to walk in here and be handed a job and be a star from day one. And he said, it didn't work out that way. He said, I walked in here. They told me I had to earn a job. They told me I had a lot to learn. And the reality of it was, he said, I had no idea how to study. I had no idea how to practice. I had no idea how to learn. I had no idea how to do any of those things. And unfortunately for Demontre Moore, although people like Michael Strahan and others tried to work with him, he never really learned what it was to really work at his craft. And I think that separates so many guys in the NFL because they're so talented. They're all so talented. Drew Lock might be more talented than Daniel Jones. He might be as talented as a lot of good starters in the league.
I agree.
But if he hasn't worked at his craft and really understands it, that's going to be the difference sometimes. That's why some guys with what you would think lesser talent, lesser physical traits are stars, and guys with the fantastic athletic testing numbers flame out. But what I wanted to ask you in reference to all of that is about what I see in the NFL as the fallacy of development. To me, the NFL doesn't develop players. The NFL practices scheme and plays and what you're supposed to do on this play over and over and over. And to me, if you don't have the physical techniques and the work ethic to study on your own, that's how you get better. You get better on your own. The NFL doesn't necessarily develop you. The NFL teaches you how to run its schemes. I just want your thought on that.
You're preaching to the choir. I talk about this on my podcast all the time, and I've been doing it for years. And it's one of those things that I love hearing what you said, because it's true. That's what scouts tell me. It's what quarterback coaches tell me that I've done consulting with. It's what it's what former players have told me. And it happens even at the college level too. I mean, it's a lot of these guys are brought in for their athletic ability, and they're expected to work on their own time. What made Peyton Manning great is that he understood how to work, and he was always figuring out how to work smart and work hard. And you have to do both. You can be a hard worker, but if you don't know what to work on or how to work on it to really ingrain it, you could spend 2 to 3 times the amount of time as someone who is able to learn it in half the time. And that's something that young guys don't get. And the Demontre Moore story is a great one because it's indicative. I mean, even Tony Gonzalez talked about, and you can go find it on YouTube, the top 100 players of all time, where Chris Collinsworth and Bill Belichick and a bunch of other guys interview some of the players that they put on that team. And they interviewed Tony Gonzalez, and he said, "You led the league in drops your second year, didn't you?" He said, "Yeah." And he said, I was this basketball prospect who basically converted to tight end, and I had a decent first season, but I dropped so many balls in my second year, and I was really depressed about it. And my brother sent me a book, a Pat Riley book, and in that book, I realized that I needed to develop my own practice habits and my own development game plan. And I started to create all these different development game plans, and I enlisted my position coaches to do these drills with me every day before and after practice. And then I did them on my own with outside people away from the practice field. And I did it for years to become the player I became. And most players now get individual private instruction and especially quarterbacks. And it is taught to scheme and game plan because so much is put into it. The playbooks are big. The execution that they're trying to look for is huge. Kyle Shanahan said this year, we expect our players to come in and be able to play, so the players need to learn on their own. And it's one of those things that a lot of these players don't figure out until it's too late. And, the ones that I talked to over the years who always were good, the players who were good, they had the same thing. And it was from different positions. But two examples. I remember interviewing DeMarco Murray when I was doing some New York Times stuff with their Fifth Down blog way long time ago. And I interviewed DeMarco Murray and I asked him, I remember seeing how you ran as a freshman and early in your career. And you reminded me more of a Reggie Bush type of player in terms of your style and the chances you took and all of those different things. And then I saw you become a more efficient player in the way that Reggie became later on in his career. But you were a more efficient player after your injury and later on in your career as an upperclassman at Oklahoma. What changed? And he said, I came to campus and I was, in Las Vegas. I was the best athlete maybe in Las Vegas in football. When I got to Oklahoma, I realized I wasn't the best athlete on my depth chart. And that realization helped me understand that I needed to work and I had to figure out how to get better at my position because there were better athletes on the defensive line than I was. I wasn't the best athlete on my team anymore. And I realized that. And I knew there were other ways to compensate and work. Marvin Jones, the longtime NFL receiver who's played with multiple teams, with the Bengals, the Lions, and the Jaguars. And when he was with the Lions, he was one of the league leaders in, contested catches, and he could be a deep threat or a slot or a flanker. And I remember interviewing him because he was dominating defensive backs, a good defensive backs class in the practices there on press release drills. And he was known as a possession receiver, but I had watched him before Keenan Allen got there, and he was their deep threat before Keenan Allen was there. And then they moved him to a possession role. So most people were only watching the recent year of tape and saw him as a possession receiver until the Senior Bowl when he was going deep on some of the best cornerbacks of that class. And I asked him about a lot of that, and he said early on, I practiced with some good cornerbacks at Cal who were good press coverage guys, and they made me work with them every day after practice to defeat them in the jam because they knew if I could beat them, I was going to beat other players and I was going to help make the team better. And I learned how to work on my press release skills, learn how to work on my route skills because of the amount of work I did after practice. And those are just two of many examples. But with quarterback especially, that's so important. And it's different for everyone. If you look at Patrick Mahomes and Bobby Stroop, who is his trainer, Bobby Stroop didn't say, we're going to try and make you into Tom Brady. We're going to work on things to help develop your body. So the things that you're doing at Texas Tech, you do them well without getting hurt. All the crazy shortstop type of movements that he does that are him playing shortstop, basically, and using shortstop techniques as a quarterback. Bobby Stroop does all these different stretching and muscle movement and training weight-bearing techniques to maximize his flexibility and then maximize all the muscle groups he uses to throw the way he does and that he did at Texas Tech. And that's different than what Tom Brady would train on. So it's about maximizing what these guys do best. And the NFL as an organization, they're like, we don't have any competition for this player group. It's not like the XFL is going to lure any of these guys away. So they know they have just a bottleneck of players coming in. And while we worry about the money and the cap and all these things, I mean, we talk about the cap being a myth, but also if the NFL were really like worried that the next Patrick Mahomes was going to be in another league, they would be focusing on developing the resources they had. But right now, they don't have to do that. So that's also an indirect contribution to the problem of developing the position.
Talk about developing the position. The other part of that with Jordan Love, going back to Patrick Mahomes, all of that, there's more discussion now about whether some of these guys should sit a little bit. And I'm curious how you feel about that, because to me it ties into, maybe some of these guys aren't ready, but is the sitting isn't necessarily going to help them get ready. To me, it's how they work while they're sitting, and do they have people around them that can help them get ready. So it's not, to me, it's not just sitting, it's how they prepare while they sit.
Without a doubt. Sitting is just the sitting itself without the work only does so much. But what it does in that small compartment of why it's helpful, regardless of whether the work's good or not, is that it gives the player the opportunity at 20, 21, 22, 24, even look, being 54 and having 3 kids over the age of 30, and who all do well. I have a retired Marine sergeant who was a Marine pilot who just retired from the Marines and has just had her first daughter, her first child. All my kids have done pretty well, in terms of being responsible kids. But to say that kids that you turn an adult and poof at 18 you're mature, when we know psychologically human beings don't really begin to mature until their mid-20s, and then the experiences they have don't really start to kick in until their 30s. And to expect someone to turn into a 40-year-old woman or 40-year-old man from 18 to 19 is just an outmoded idea of understanding development. And as someone who wants to support that as a parent so that you can have adult relationships with your adult kids, part of that is understanding that they need some time to absorb things, and see how things work out and make some mistakes. And so sitting at least allows you to understand, get acquainted to where you've moved, get acquainted to the fact that now you're even a higher level of famous, having a higher level of scrutiny, that people are going to be asking you for money, that you're going to be managing a lot more money in your life, and you're just learning how to do that, probably because most people don't come out of their house as financial analysts and wealth managers, and they're having to develop new relationships with these people and trust them, and see whether they can trust them. They're going to a new team. They're going to realize the higher level, like you said. All these things require bandwidth, whether we say so or not. And when then you have to learn a new playbook at a higher level of against higher level of athletes and complex defenses, and everything's going quick, even the things you've learned, if you're playing right away, even the things that you thought you had ingrained because you're thinking now, you start to slip up on things that you had worked on years ago and thought you had down. And now you start to show things that fans criticize you for and say, his footwork is awful. I thought he was told he had good footwork. Those scouts don't know what they're talking about. And you're like, then you go back and watch their tape at Duke or wherever they were. I'm not referring to Daniel Jones, but it just came to mind because, in terms of Duke.
Of course you are.
No, but I'm not, because his footwork was fine, I thought. But, when that happens, things slow down. You're everything's going so fast that you're overthinking things that you didn't overthink before, and you have mistakes. So when you sit, you have the chance to at least get everything else in your life in order, start to learn how to work within the NFL stuff and learn the playbook and get a lot of that down. And then you can start working on the techniques and transfer the field. But then at that point, after, I'd say at least half a season, you should sit for that reason alone. And then beyond that, like you said, it's about the infrastructure, whether you know how to work, how you know how to do that, and how the team's going to approach that. Because if you come to your coach like across the city here saying Sam Darnold talking to Adam Gase and saying I'm seeing ghosts on a Monday Night Football game, that's the time that your coach should probably bench you and give you a chance to stop seeing ghosts. Because if you keep seeing them, you're going to be wrecked more likely because there's too many bad experiences. Because it's like having your hand in a windowsill. If someone shuts the windowsill on your hand once and you get it taken care of and you don't have that experience again for a while, you could stick your hand in a windowsill and your hand's probably not going to shake unconsciously, But if it happens 10 times in a row, you could wait a year and come back in a year and put your hand in that windowsill, and I guarantee you're going to be kind of doing this and having the jitters doing that because it's just psychological, and it happens with quarterbacks because of the way they take punishment.
It's such a different level of athletic competition. But as you were talking about that, I was thinking about the fact that I've coached youth basketball now for 25 years. And I don't know how many times I've watched these young kids, whether they're 8, whether they're 12, whether they're 13, whether they're in their first or second year playing, or whether I've had them for 4 or 5 years. I don't know how many times I've turned around on the bench and watching a game and said, these kids look like they never picked up a basketball before. Yeah. For the simple reason that I know that they know how to do these things because we've done them over and over and over and over. But when you get into competition, when you're hoping that muscle memory takes over, if it's not fully ingrained and you're overly excited, or I had an offensive lineman from the Giants at the end of the season, a young man named Marcus McCutcheon, offensive lineman, drafted in the 5th round in 2022, missed his entire rookie year with a torn ACL, and never got to play in a preseason game because he tore the ACL in a blue and white scrimmage before preseason even started. Missed half of training camp still returning from that ACL. Played 20 snaps in the preseason. By week 2 of the regular season this past year, the Giants had put him in the starting lineup. And he was talented, yes, but completely overwhelmed and out of place. And he said to me at the end of the year, I talked to him about it at the end of the year, and he said, man, he said, it was so fast. He said, I heard every crowd noise. I heard everything from the sidelines. He said, I was looking at and hearing everything except what I was supposed to hear, which was the play call and figuring out who I was supposed to block.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thing, when that happens at quarterback, that doesn't just blow up a play, that blows up games.
Yes. That's so true. And at the gist of everything, if you distill everything down we've talked about, quarterback is a performance position. It's not a science. And it is an improvisational performance position. Just like whether it's acting or stage performance like stand-up comedy or music where there's a lot of improvisation, you have theory of quarterbacking, which is reading coverage. You have and post-snap, pre-snap tells and things, positioning with alignments, and the chess of like strategy of like moving your players around to get those matchups, and being able to identify little moves by defensive backs late in the pre-snap to know whether or not they're playing man or zone. Then you have the technique of your footwork with your dropbacks, your release timing, how you move in the pocket efficiently so that you can keep your body in position to throw, different arm angles and slots that you throw so that you can deliver with accuracy. Also, the knowing timing of when to place that ball in the coverage. Sometimes you got to place it where it looks inaccurate, but that's where it needs to be. And the anticipation to do all of that, and you have to do it in less than 2.5 seconds, where if the consequences could be a 325-pound man running at 15 miles per hour headlong into you, and the impacts of those things. So there are very smart players, and the NFL has used the Wonderlic in the past, and they looked at different things, and they were looking for intelligence to retain plays. But I think we've seen that, like Alex Smith is an example of a very good college quarterback and a good NFL quarterback, but not a top NFL starter. And he was a good example of an extremely book smart individual who I always joked he was like the economist of quarterbacks. Like, he knew all the theory and had all the right answers when you had him away from the field, but when you put him on the field and in that quick moment, if you think a recession might be coming as an average individual on the street and not an economist, you're probably going to do something different with your money than you would as an economist who would say, well, I need all the data first, and all that data's got to come. And then 6 months after the recession actually hit, I can declare that we've had a recession. Or in another way of putting that is, if stand-up comedy is a good equivalent of quarterbacking, because it's about timing and how you deliver a joke. You can have great material. Alex Smith wrote great material, but his jokes fell flat because he didn't have good timing. Whereas Brett Favre only had fart jokes, but he told them with such great timing that they invariably, most of them hit. And the ones that were really bad, you tended to forget about as a Packers fan, because the ones that hit they hit so big that it made a huge impact. And I think if you look at stand-up comedians the same way, because go and count how many jokes you actually laughed your behind off on of your favorite comedian, whether it's Bill Burr or Richard Pryor or Robin Williams or whoever. And you'll probably count a lot of incomplete passes, some interceptions, some fumbles of the snap, but the ones that they hit on are game winners. And I think that that's what we have to look at with quarterbacking, is it's the confidence and timing in which you deliver, and how you can take what the audience is doing, because the audience is like the opposing defense sometimes in comedy, and how they deliver something at you, and how you either riff off of it or redirect it or ignore it, and be able to move forward and get people laughing again. And I think that with quarterbacking, that's a different form of intelligence, because people don't think of Brett Favre as cerebral, but he was also basically probably the founder of the RPO. Whether you like him or not off the field and the things that are about going on in the news, we're talking about scouting. We're not talking about individuals' character and all that kind of stuff. We're just talking about how they played. And he was one of the great quarterbacks in the league because, like you said, he didn't have to pay attention. He didn't pay attention to the crowd. He was paying attention to the things that mattered. Or if you were Joe Montana, he could, in a pressure-filled moment, he could redirect his team and say, see everybody being tight and go, look over there. It's John Candy. Isn't that John Candy in the stands? In that 89 Super Bowl, I believe, against the Bengals, where they drove the length of the field in Miami. And the whole team was talking about how poised he was, because he knew, emotional intelligence wise, which you don't measure on a whiteboard, to say, we need these guys to calm down, instead of saying, hey, calm down, because you're going to tighten up when you tell people to calm down. He's going to start making light of something. They go, well, dude, if our quarterback's just relaxed and he's laughing about John Candy being in the stands, we're going to win this game. Like, we're good. Like, John Elway, to much my chagrin as a Cleveland Browns fan, back in the 80s with the drive, and when the Browns kicked off and they had the ball at the 2 and they were losing, and it looked like the Browns were going to the Super Bowl, and he looked at his team and said, we got them right where we want them. I mean, if you're a teammate and hearing that, that's why it's so much more than just whether you remember plays and whether you had good completion percentage and a big arm and a big body. It all fits together. And the glue of the poise and the processing and how you work, that's the glue of all those things that we're looking at on the surface most of the time. And then we wonder why it doesn't work out.
All right, Matt, let's turn to talking a little bit about the 2024 class, about some of these guys. And I'm going to ask you first about JJ McCarthy, but I'm going to say this. Another one of the fallacies that we talk about leading up to the draft is guys, quote unquote, rising and falling up draft boards. And I think that idea, to me, and I'm probably guilty of this too, as part of the media that writes about the draft on a day-to-day basis. To me, that tends to be the media just either catching up with the NFL or buying the narrative that so and so's favorite agent is selling.
Yes.
And I so you can talk about that, but I want you to talk about that in reference to the quote unquote rise of JJ McCarthy.
Yeah.
And do you believe he's a top 5, top 6 guy? Um, and and how did he get there when the media per se looked at him and said, second round pick?
Right. And I think that, as my colleague at Football Guy Sigmund Bloom said yesterday during a conversation, it seems to have all coincided with Jim Harbaugh saying, singing the praises of JJ McCarthy. And I'd like to joke, well, if he had the stones of Buddy Ryan, he'd trade Justin Herbert and get some capital and take JJ McCarthy and put his money where his mouth is. But having Buddy Ryan stones doesn't necessarily mean that that's actually smart.
Well, the reality of that is there's probably some truth in what Harbaugh is saying, but there's also a lot of self-serving. It's better for me if I can convince somebody to come up and take him at 4, because then I get Marvin Harrison, or then I get to pick from this group of wide receivers. So
Exactly.
it's all self-serving.
It sure is. And a lot of what's told to the media at this time of year, as we all know, is hoping that it generates a narrative and catches on. The problem with that is that there can be a disconnect between head coaches, GMs, and other executive leadership, especially owners. One of the things that I hear most frequently from longtime scouts or former scouts who had a long time tenure in the league and left the league was that the most frustrating thing as a scout or a scouting director was to do the years of work on these guys, and in the 11th hour, the owner changes the whole course of the draft because they demand the player they want. And it sometimes can be driven by what they hear in mass media. They can hear somebody who's a persuasive talker or someone whose rhetoric is great and they're very dramatic in the way that they share their views. And next thing you know, we had a high grade on this guy that we could have gotten, and now he's off our board, and we're taking this guy who got drunk before his pro day, and his receivers got drunk with him, and they were all passed out, and he was throwing to his accountants and his agents and students who were on the intramural football team, and we still took him, and we have no say about it, because if we raised our voices, we'd probably get fired, and it's hard to get back in the league once you're fired as a scout. So that's what I hear a lot. So in relation to McCarthy, okay, McCarthy is a top 5 quarterback in my eyes in this class. He's my 5th quarterback. He was one of the more difficult evaluations I've had to do in recent years, mainly because he's very good in a technique standpoint. He's got excellent footwork. It's quick. It's fluid. It creates a great base for him to throw accurate passes, especially in the short and intermediate game. He has some placement with his passing that and decision making that is very high end at moments and very low end at other moments. Now, where Zach Wilson, as a good example, had a lot of hype, he only had low moments I saw on tape, and the high moments were things that people said were high moments, but I thought, no, that's what every quarterback who's ever going to have an NFL contract, not much less a starter, should be able to do. I've not seen high moments of processing from this guy. JJ McCarthy, while he has some of Zach Wilson's low moments on his tape with processing and placement, he has a lot of high moments that Wilson never had. His pocket skills are very smooth, and the ability to be efficient but dynamic with his movement and then throw an accurate pass is there. Zach Wilson never had that either. So there's real fundamentals that make him a worthwhile quarterback. And I think what happens is that, media, oftentimes they're looking at either draft analysts or agents talking about their players. I'm talking about these players. And a lot of the draft analysts who are in big media talking, they're watching 300 to 500 players a year. Even if you're like me and I'm only watching 150, but I would put that I probably watch them as in depth as any of those draft analysts, if not more in depth than some of them do, because of how they have to cover the breadth of the draft. I'm more siloed and I go really deep. But regardless of which way you go, it's demanding. You're not going to, and if you're expected to have a take on JJ McCarthy in October, when you've just spent I don't know, the past 120 hours watching defensive ends to catch up with that, you're not gonna have the same nuanced take of JJ McCarthy in October that you're gonna have in January.
Well,
And I
one of
think,
the
yeah,
I was going to say, when I think about that, I think about the fact that the talking heads, the guys that are on ESPN all the time, Mel Kiper and all of that, these guys have to talk about these guys every day.
yep,
And in the job that I do at Big Blue View, we have to write multiple stories, sometimes 8 to 10 to 12, depending on what's going on every day. And you don't get to, as you said, silo in and really look at these guys deeply in that way. So you have more surface knowledge. You see a little bit of what you see, and you formulate an opinion, and then you just run with it.
yeah, yeah. And it's the nature of the beast and how it goes. I mean, these guys, the breadth of knowledge in the draft that a lot of these guys have, that's valuable. It's valuable. It's worthwhile to understand. But at the same time, it just takes longer to dig deep if you're going to dig deep with it because of those demands. So I think McCarthy's a little bit of teams catching up. A little bit of it is maybe taking what was said about him and creating a little bit more, and it's created a little bit more scrutiny of his game, and it's come, the scrutinization has passed muster enough. Now, I think he has some unproven things with his game that keep him on the low end of that top 5, because maybe he is an accurate deep thrower, but I didn't see a lot of deep throws in his game, and the ones I saw weren't that great. And it had nothing to do with his receivers, because again, receiver drops aren't a part of what I'm looking at. I'm looking about whether if the receiver should have caught the ball, it's accurate. Even if the receiver had to perform, say, a certain maneuver that looks like it's not a pinpoint accurate pass, but in concept, it's a pinpoint accurate pass, and they drop it, that's still accurate to me when I chart him. So that's why I had Lamar Jackson high, because his charting was great compared to what his accuracy was. And I had Baker Mayfield low because his accuracy was great completion percentage wise, but his charting was not nearly as good. And McCarthy's charting's good in short and intermediate. but in the vertical and deep games, it's not quite as strong. And there are some decisions, especially in the red zone and deep in his own area, where he makes some immature mistakes, a lot of immature mistakes repeatedly in multiple years, including last year, where, I understand he's good on third and fourth down, but red zone and deep in your own territory are two areas where you practice a lot because they know how pivotal that is. And his game needs work there. And, can it get better? It can. But if you're thinking about a lot of other things and you're thrust into a game early, he may need a little bit more time too, because those are the areas that are going to be difficult for him. And if he doesn't overcome those things, he's probably in Drew Lock's shoes right now, a guy who might get better, but we're hoping, but we know he's got talent, but we're not sure if he's the guy who can carry the load. And I think that's where JJ McCarthy is right now.
Have to ask you, let's go to Drake Maye.
Sure.
You have Drake Maye as QB6. And I remember back in the day when we talked about Daniel Jones, you talked about Daniel Jones as a robo QB, as a guy who could do what he was told to do, but had a hard time going beyond that. You've used the same phrase in reference to Drake Maye, and it caught my attention. And the other thing that catches my attention with Drake Maye is he is, of course, the prototype for what everyone has looked at as a quarterback forever. Big, strong, good arm, all of those things. He looks like what a quarterback has always looked like, in everybody's eyes. And yet, what you said, and I actually wrote it down here in your guide, and I've kind of seen this from other people before. You said Maye's game has the greatest trap door of the top prospects, which of course means has the biggest opportunity for him to wind up at his floor instead of at his ceiling. Just tell me what scares you about Drake Maye.
Yeah, and robo quarterback to me is the quarterback who looks that they came straight out of central casting to be a quarterback in the NFL. The way you described it was perfect. He while he's tough in the pocket in terms of willing to take a hit, it's one of his greatest assets psychologically, emotionally. He drifts out of the pocket too early and basically ruins the position his blockers have when he didn't need to. So he'll actually invite pressure that he shouldn't invite. He should be climbing. Instead, he either turns away, turns his back to pressure, or rolls to a side, and then realizes he didn't need to do that, or stops and realizes he drifted too far. And now the edge pressure has position, and now he's truly under pressure when he could have avoided inducing that pressure. It looks like from when you're watching him look at the field pre-snap that he identifies a coverage advantage for his receiver pre-snap, but then goes away from it, not to manipulate, but goes away because he doesn't want to take the quick answer. Instead, he goes to look for the big play. And then when he comes back to that quick answer that he thought he had, it's gone. And now he doesn't throw the ball away. It took 6 games for me to watch him throw a ball away, which even from a college hero ball standpoint that is typical of big arm prospects, robo QBs like him, I usually see at least 1 or 2 balls thrown away per game, even if they could have thrown away another 5 or 6. The fact that it took him 6 games that I watched last year, 6 games, for him to throw away his first pass, and it was in the second half of a game, that's a little scary. That tells you that he's not thinking cerebrally about managing the game well. He has managing goofs in the red zone where he's throwing the ball blind. He has areas where he sees the leverage advantage and he's 1 to 2 beats late to throw the ball. There's some minor mechanical deficiencies that could get exacerbated because of these issues and having to learn a playbook and having to be the man right away. And I'm worried because him being the robo quarterback out of central casting who has the big arm and everything you mentioned, plus the stats, even though when you chart his accuracy, it's much worse, like Baker Mayfield's, than his completion percentage. And so, as a result of that, I fear that if he doesn't have time to play, to work on his craft, sit and learn to work, and watch a quality starter in front of him and work the scout team and then get some playing time and mop up duty. And then while a guy's maybe hurt later on to where he can get tested a little bit, but know that he's not having to be the man long term, but it's not going to determine the course of his career if he makes a mistake. If he doesn't get that, the chances are higher that the demands of the game are going to slow him down in a level where he's going to end up overthinking the same problems he has now that are going to become more fatal flaws for his game. So he could be very good. All the things you mentioned, and he does make some good throws. He does have some moments of reading good leverage. He's tough as nails. The vertical game has some real high points to it. Love the athletic ability, but I don't think he's ready for prime time. And I'm rooting for players like him to get to sit because you don't want to see, if you're looking at it from a cold level, you don't want to see the NFL waste resources. From an individual level, I want to see Drake Maye succeed. Even if I don't think he's good now to be a starter, I think he could be good.
I want to ask you about the other quarterback who increasingly these days, as we get closer and closer to the draft, seems to get connected to the Giants. And he gets connected to the Giants in the idea that, well, they could take a wide receiver at 6 and wait until 47, or use some assets and trade up into, the middle to the late part of the first round and go get this guy. And that, of course, is Michael Penix. Now, two things that I want to preface this with. I know you have Penix as QB2 on your list. And the other thing is that, I see it. I see it when he throws the football. The thing that makes everybody squeamish, which you can't really judge in your film study, is how NFL teams are going to react to his injury history and whether the Giants, using Daniel Jones' injury history as part of the reason for moving on, could sell, moving on with a guy who has a longer injury history. But with all of that said, tell me why you have Michael Penix at QB2.
Sure. And for Michael Penix, when you watch his game, especially at Indiana, and really it happened both at Indiana and Washington, is how well he handled pressure. We talk about the injuries that he had, but what we don't discuss often enough in the national spotlight is how few mistakes he made at Indiana while wearing Big Ten defenders like a second layer of skin. I mean, he didn't have protection at all. I mean, sometimes he didn't have more than 1.5 seconds to get rid of the ball on a frequent basis at Indiana. So he took hits over and over again, and he didn't David Carr, or was it Derek? It was Derek. Derek's the younger one, right?
Mm-hmm,
So
right.
David, yeah, he didn't turn into a David Carr, getting killed like that. He actually continued to get better as a player. He's accurate in the middle of the field, which people don't always sell as well as they should, or like don't notice as well as they should. He's kind of the anti-Drake Maye right now in the sense that he will climb the pocket, and find the solution in the middle of the field. Um, he is wise about how he buys time, and whether it's to get rid of the ball or find the open man, he makes unbelievable throws. And he's a player that, despite the injuries, the things that he has to work on, think about the fact that he didn't get to work on them because he was rehabbing ACL tears, and do we know the percentage chance of injury rising due to an ACL tear is minimal when you look at studies. It's not like it goes up 50%. It's not even like it goes up 10%, So it's a minimal thing. People worry about that, but really when you look at his game, he manipulates defenders well. He moves in the pocket like a pro. He has better athletic ability. Now people are just realizing that better athletic ability than he's shown. He can take hits, and he didn't turn into a worse player as a result of it. If anything, we should be looking at him as a battle-tested quarterback with an incredible skill for throwing the vertical game, with underrated ability in the middle of the field that should get better as he starts to deal with more complex coverages that all these guys are going to have to deal with. So, the Daniel Jones thing with the injuries, I mean, this is just my take, and I think everybody who's a Giants fan who's listened to this show for years probably knows that I was not a high on Daniel Jones. So I think that the injury thing is probably also a nicer way of saying we've seen what we've seen, and there's good elements to Daniel Jones' game, but there's things that's got a ceiling that we just feel like we'd like to move on from, and this is going to be our swan song with him. And we'll just put it nicely that way, because we do want another year out of him. He's going to benefit us either on the field or behind the scenes. And there's a lot he can do to benefit. He's a good NFL quarterback. He's turned into a good NFL quarterback. Do I think he's a top-notch starter? No. And I think that teams are looking for a top-notch starter.
Absolutely. I hear you. My take has been that it's time. Whatever you say about the situation with Daniel Jones and whoever you want to blame and all of that, you just look at it. You're heading into year 6. You're heading into a year when he's in the final year of his guaranteed money in his contract. You're in a position in the draft where it might be possible. So it just makes sense to move on, because there's, I as you said, I think you've seen what you're going to see. But Matt, I wanted to ask you, we haven't talked about Bo Nix. We haven't talked about Jaden Daniels. We could do that all day. But there's a possibility for the Giants that they get into a scenario where top 4 quarterbacks are gone. They don't get one of those guys. You're probably not taking Michael Penix at 6.
Right.
I think that's...
He'll be a second round pick, I think. He's going to end up in the second round.
I was going to say the scenario would be somebody jumps up in front of you or takes Michael Penix earlier than you think, and you don't get Penix, you don't get Nix, but you still want a young guy in the room. You want, a flyer. You want a guy that gives you an option or a possibility. Just quickly give me, your guy that might be a round 3 guy, a day 3 guy that you think is going to end up outperforming that draft slot.
Well, I don't think Bo Nix is probably going to fall that far, but we'll say, if we talk about Bo Nix, I'll just say this: his upside is Matt Ryan. That's how I would look at it. Like he's that type of player, and we'll just keep it quick like that. Jalen Daniels, I'll just mention real quick with him too, is that I don't think he's Lamar Jackson. He's not as good in the pocket. He's fast like Jackson, but he's not as savvy of a runner. But he's got a better deep ball than Jackson. I would say Lamar Jackson got overly coddled in a way that he didn't need by the Ravens with Greg Roman's offense. And I think he was able to prove that last year that they could expand the offense and he could handle it. And they finally got the message. I think Jaden Daniels may need a little bit more of that Lamar Jackson coddling, because he's not as great of a processor. Like he, I've heard, I'll just, I'll say this because I think people probably have heard it. I have a lot of respect for Greg Cosell, and I've had the opportunity to talk with him in the past. And, obviously he watches a lot of film and he does a good job. He's a student of the game. His take is that Jaden Daniels is a good processor on the field. My take, and I've had conversations with others, I'm not going to pull into it, I'm going to own my own take on this, is that I think there are times his processing is good, but there are times where he has tragic comic timing where he should see the coverage, know his receiver's route, and know that he should wait just one step further and it's going to break open. But he'll end up turning away from a receiver that's about to break open just as the receiver breaks open. And he's done that so often that I think he's still got some things to integrate with his game. So to me, he's going to need a little bit of time too. So the guys that might have an opportunity to develop, who are third round, maybe Spencer Radler. His man-to-man coverage reading skills are very good. He's improved as a player since his early years at Oklahoma. He's pretty good in the pocket. He's kind of got that Baker Mayfield, like the good version of Baker Mayfield potential, but he has very poor understanding of zone coverage right now. Like if he were as good at zone as he was at man, he'd be a top 3 quarterback in this class. But to me, he's my QB7. And I think he does have a chance to contribute and maybe be that journeyman starter, and maybe go beyond that. He's a guy that's interesting. I think Jordan Travis is kind of interesting, but probably more as a journeyman starter at best, kind of a Jeff Garcia, Jeff Blake mashup of a guy who has pretty deep balls that he can throw, and he'll throw to tight coverage areas with appropriate aggression, but he just has to become a wiser field general with how he makes decisions, how he manages the game, and if he can do that and get healthy, he has some of those skills. Beyond that, a lot of these guys, I mean, Michael Pratt, Jack Plummer out of Louisville, they have the physical tools maybe, but I think that their games are too far away for me to feel like that's going to happen. Maybe I know a lot of people are talking about Joe Milton because he's 6'5", 235 and can throw the ball a country mile. I'm talking like 65 yards. Like, is he the next Dante Culpepper? I hear people talk about that. I think he has a long way to go before that happens. I think he's a UDFA signing that's going to be, but he's going to be signed. For me, I'd much rather have Sam Hartman from Notre Dame and Wake Forest, who has a limited arm, and take a chance on him on day 3 because he actually is aggressive downfield with the throws he knows he can make and has a command of the pocket. But he's more. I'd rather take a chance on a future Rich Gannon than on a guy who maybe has a slight hope on Dante Culpepper. But I don't think Hartman's even going to get there either. So for me, it's Travis, and probably Radler are the two that I would be intrigued by, and maybe Austin Reed, who really fits the ball well, and if he can fix some of the mechanical stuff with his feet, he could be intriguing too. Western Kentucky kid.
Cool. All right, Matt. I think what we're going to do is we're going to stop there. And what we're going to do, as I said at the top of the show, we're going to do this in 2 parts. The second part of the show is going to be wide receiver, tight end, and running back. So Giants fans, please come back for our next episode, part 2 of our lengthy and hopefully enlightening discussion with Matt Waldman. So for now, I'm going to sign off. As always, thank you for listening. Please stay safe out there. Take care of each other, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.